So thus far, we've just used veneer, either 1/16 constructional thickness veneer or standard thickness veneer, and we haven't really discussed the option of having a custom thickness veneer, which you could cut yourself off of the table saw, or depending on how well your bandsaw is set up, your bandsaw and planer. So for the most part, I try to steer people away from cutting their own veneers because when veneer is manufactured, the logs, grade A lumber, so one of the highest quality cuts of lumber, while it's still completely saturated with moisture, will be sliced into veneer sequentially. So there's actually zero waste in this process because it's just cut using a knife rather than using a blade, like the table saw blade. And you don't lose all the material you would normally lose in the kerf of a table saw blade. But every once in a while, it's very justifiable to cut your own thickness veneers. A couple reasons why you might want to cut your own thickness veneers. Say you're bending a very shallow curve and you can actually get away with a very thick veneer such as 3/32 or 1/8 or even 3/16. It can be more practical at that point to just cut your own veneer rather than trying to order a special thickness from Certainly Wood or Berkshire. Another reason would be if you are making a very small scale project and it's just not worth paying the extra shipping from a veneer supplier when you could easily buy the cheaper solid wood, cut your own veneer, and just take into account the waste. And then a third reason would be if, say, you wanted to then mill your veneer after you've already cut it to thickness. So say you wanted to create a tapered veneer, so going from thick to thin along its entire length. Or this particular taper is going from thin to thick to thin, or vice versa. So if you have a particular bend that you want to accomplish where the thickness of the veneer becomes very thin the tighter the curve is, and very thick the more structural the curve is, that can be a great use of custom thickness veneer. And I'd say another possibility would be, say, if you were bending a really wide sheet of veneer, you can actually tape together wide pieces of veneer and then you could flat mill them on a CNC or something similar in a more industrial setting. But these are just some reasons why you might cut your own veneer off of the table saw. So for setting up a veneer thickness cut on the table saw, obviously you want all of your veneers coming off the table saw to be about the same thickness and very consistent thickness without too many machine marks or burn marks. So it's not going to make too much sense to set the thickness of the table saw with the fence, because then we'll have very thin pieces of wood trapped right alongside the blade, and it won't be structural enough to really push it through the cut. So instead we're going to be using this thin rip table saw jig, which the school has in the monitor cubby. And what I've done is I've set the thickness of my veneer to come off on the waist side. And I believe I've set it to about 1/4 of an inch so that I can make a tapered veneer out of it. And you can use a thin rip blade to slightly minimize your waste. This is a standard 1/8 inch blade. Thin rip blades are typically around 3/32, so you're not minimizing your waste that much, only by about 25%. But say you were cutting 1/16 thickness veneer, 2/3 of your lumber is just going straight into the dust collector. So it could be worth it at that point to switch to a thin rip blade and save just a little bit of lumber along the way. But what's going to happen is I'm going to set this thin rip jig has a little bearing, a single point bearing right at the tip where it comes in contact with the edge of your lumber. And I'm going to set that jig so that the bearing is just in contact with the edge of the lumber. Make sure it's nice and snug. And that's just gonna stay that way. The only thing that I'm gonna be moving in this setup is actually my fence. So I'm gonna take a cut, and then I'm gonna move my fence so that once again, my lumber is hugged between the single point ball bearing, our single point bearing, and the fence. So I'm consistently always going to be cutting 1/4 of an inch thickness. If you are cutting a really thin veneer, there can be a tendency for the veneer, because it is on the waste side of the saw, to start flapping around and damage itself. So if you can, ask a second person to be on hand to just pull your pieces off for you, so that way you don't compromise your safety while you're cutting the veneer. So I have my cut all set up to go. I have my thin rip table saw jig snugged up against the edge of my wood. It'll be cutting a 1/4 inch thick, just a little shy of a 1/4 inch thick laminate. One other thing that I forgot to mention was that one really useful thing about resawing your own veneer is that you don't have to spend the extra money on quarter sawn lumber. This is just flat sawn poplar, and because the edge grain of a flat sawn piece of lumber is always quarter sawn, as I cut these pieces of veneer and change the orientation of my lamination, I'm actually cutting quarter sawn pieces of veneer. So you can save a lot of money potentially just resawing your own veneer.